We're now going to talk about something called scope. And scope is essentially a way of defining the range of lifetime of a particular component, because so far we've made an assumption that the component just basically lives forever. It lives as long as the program is running, which might not necessarily be what you want. So we're going to kind of learn about fine-tuning this process and making sure that your components only live as long as you want them to live. So let's begin with a very simple example of making scopes. So as before, I'm going to make a builder, new container builder. Then I'm going to register a type. So I'm going to go builder.register type. I'm going to register the console log as an ilog, like so. And then what I'm going to do is I'll build a container. So I'll say var container equals builder.build. But now, instead of just using container.resolve like we did before, remember we typically, when we wanted a component, we said container.resolve and we took an ilog, for example. So we wrote something like resolve ilog. We're now going to constrain the lifetime of that ilog. We're going to say that we have, well, we're essentially going to make something similar to a using statement. In actual fact, we are going to make a using statement. So here is the idea. We'll make a using statement where we're going to say var scope equals container.begin lifetime scope. So in this case, what we're saying is we're defining this region, and inside this region, the components are going to live, but unfortunately, as soon as we exit the region at the closing curly brace, the components are going to die. And when I say die, I mean they're going to be disposed, basically. So here you would take the log. Typically, you would say var log equals scope.resolve. Notice it's scope.resolve, not container.resolve. So now it is the scope which is resolving a particular ilog, and then we can do log.write and put in something here like testing, for example. So this is a very small illustration of scopes. And then, of course, we have different ways of customizing the scope. And by the way, here is the output. So customization of the scopes allow you to have components with different lifetimes, components which exist for the entire duration of the application, or maybe you want a component which only lives while there is a window open, which actually uses this component, and then the component gets cleaned up. This is particularly important for deterministic finalization, in the sense that some components you might want to get rid of, especially if they're holding unmanaged resources, for example. This is reasonably important, so this is what we're going to take a look at. And there are different lifetimes that you can define for a component. We're going to discuss all of them. Now, most of them show up when you do register type. So when you register a type, you can also specify the lifetime behavior of a component. And the default behavior, which we're not seeing here, but we could actually add as the end here, is called instance per dependency. So what does this mean? This basically means that every time you resolve a particular component, like an ilog, you get a brand new log. Now, in terms of logging, this doesn't make much sense, to be honest, because typically if you're writing to a console, you would have a single console log for everything that's happening in your system. So you might want a single instance per the entire application. Now, there are different ways of doing it, and we've already seen the way where instead of register type, you do register instance. Remember the whole register instance bit, but now we can do it differently. So this time around, we can actually do register type, but we can configure the component to be single instance. And in this case, let's actually jump into console log for a moment. So I'm going to go into console log here, and I'm going to add a constructor so that we see what's going on. So let's put in a constructor here, and I'm just going to console.writeLine, creating a console log exclamation mark. So coming back to the main method, first of all, I'm going to comment out single instance for now, and we'll take a look at what happens if you just get the log twice. So you resolve it once and then you resolve it again. So resolve ilog. So we're going to resolve it again, and when I execute this, you're going to see that we're basically creating a console log twice. Now, if I turn on single instance and I execute this once again, well, you can see that we are creating a console log. So this is great. This gets us somewhere. But there are more things that we need to discuss and more lifetimes which are available. So one of those lifetimes is called instance per lifetime scope. That's a bit more complicated for us to present, so I'm going to get rid of this using here, and we're going to do something different. So what exactly is instance per lifetime scope? Well, just as the name suggests, you're going to get an instance for every single lifetime that you make. So for us to actually be able to illustrate this somehow, I'm going to set up a scenario where we're going to basically have scope, and we'll also have a scope within a scope as well. So that's actually allowed. You can have a scope within a scope. So here what I'm going to do after I build the container is I'm going to be using var scope1 equals container.begin lifetime scope. And here, for example, I may resolve and output something on the log a few times. Actually, I'll just do the resolve. So I'll do scope1.resolve, and I'll say console log, like so. In actual fact, we better do it in some sort of for loop. So let's have a loop going from 1 to 3, for example, or from 0 to 3, as the case may be. That's where we're going to just resolve it. We're not going to output anything because that's going to be too much information. And then, of course, if I make another scope here, then I can sort of call it scope 2, and I can resolve on scope 2 as well. And after I add all the necessary semicolons, we can see what the end result is. So just as a reminder, we're doing instance per lifetime scope. So here is one scope, and here is another scope, but we have a list of 3 invocations of resolve in each. So how many constructors are we going to invoke? And the answer is, oops, we actually we get an exception because we're trying to resolve console log instead of just doing an ilog. So I'll get rid of this for now. That's an extra complication. Hopefully you trust me that if I had an ilog there, that would be fine. So essentially we're creating a console log just twice because we are making an instance per lifetime. And since we have 2 lifetimes, scope 1 and scope 2, we're having 2 constructors invoked for the console log itself. Okay, so this is a more complicated scenario, but not as complicated as it's going to get, because now we're going to have these named lifetime scopes, and they're going to be particularly painful. So let me show you something. So we're going to have instance per matching lifetime scope, and this time around what you can do is you can give the scope a tag. So I'm going to give it a tag foo. Okay, so this is going to be a bit more complicated because essentially what's going to happen now is you're going to have a lifetime for the component per the lifetime scope that's named foo. So you have to put in a foo in here. But we're going to make it even more complicated because in addition to just having scopes, you can also nest them. And that's a really cool thing that you can do. So essentially I have a loop here for scope1.resolve. And then what if I get rid of this scope, like so? I'll put it in here inside scope 1, and then of course instead of container.begin lifetime scope, I have to do scope 1.begin lifetime scope. So we now have scope 1, and within that scope we have a second scope 2, and within that we also try to kind of resolve something. So let's try to execute it in this particular case and see if we get any problems or anything like that. So we have a single console log being created for the given lifetime. So we have the scope foo, and for that scope, even though we have an inner scope, which is okay, we're still in scope foo. We're now creating this this object just once. So this is the instance per matching lifetime scope. There are additional scopes that are a bit more difficult for us to actually discuss. So let me just mention some of them. I'll go up here and I'll get rid of this one. So another scope which is useful for ASP.NET is called instance per request. And by the way, if you're using ASP.NET Core, that's not the scope to use. But if you're using the old ASP.NET, ASP.NET MVC, you need this instance per request. In addition, we have something else. We have instance instance per owned. Now, instance per owned unfortunately requires an understanding of another concept that we haven't covered, and that concept is implicit relationship types. So until you understand implicit relationship types, it will be very difficult for you to understand what instance per owned actually is. And one thing that's missing from the container, one thing that doesn't exist, is the thread scope. So other dependency injection containers, they allow you to make sure that the instance that gets created once per thread. So whenever you have a new thread, you get a new instance of whatever component. Now in Orderfak, you don't get this, so you would have to use instance per lifetime scope, and you would have to make new lifetimes per thread, so to speak. So it's not something that the container handles for you. Unfortunately, you have to do it yourself. It's not particularly difficult to do though. Okay, so let me come back to the named lifetime scope, the per lifetime matching. So if I go back and I say instance per matching lifetime scope, and we go with foo, the idea here is that, as I mentioned, the creation of the component console log is going to be once per lifetime. But there is a catch in that you need to be able to resolve the component in this lifetime. What this means in practice is, if I do something like using a var scope 3 equals container dot begin lifetime scope, and then within this lifetime scope I attempt to resolve console log, so I say scope 3 dot resolve console log, like so, that's not even going to work. That's just going to crash. And the reason for that is that in this lifetime, you can see it crashing here, in this lifetime, because the container is only capable of creating instances of console log for the lifetime scope with a tag foo. If you try to create it when you don't have a tag, this is going to result in an exception. So the component console log isn't actually available in scope 3. So this has been a small overview of the different lifetime settings that you can do when you register the types, and we're going to continue on with this idea of lifetimes in the next lesson.